right, final week of March Madness. We have loved doing this, just having fun, being creative, so that we can laugh and just enjoy the Word of God together. So as we dive into week number 5 of March Madness, I've got to tell you a story. When I was growing up, we were playing our rival. And if you know me, you know I am very, very competitive, and I hate losing at anything. And so as I grew up, everything in our house was a competition. It doesn't matter what it is. We competed in everything. And so I've instilled that godly characteristic into my kids, teaching them what is right. But when I was in high school and we were playing basketball and we were on the basketball court, the team that we were playing, our rival, we always beat them in football, but they always beat us in basketball. And so this one time we were playing them, and they had a really good team. And I'm guarding a guy, and as I'm guarding him, he wasn't getting very many shots. And I think it was because of my defense, I'm not sure. But as he's running up and down the court, I begin to talk to him. And I begin to just encourage him. And I just begin to whisper in his ear, hey, man, your teammates must think you're really good. You haven't touched the ball all game. Hey, they must really, really want to pass you the ball. Listen, you were standing here wide open, and that guy was doubled, and he still took the shot. He believes in you, doesn't he? Hey, man, you're our best player. Thanks, man. When we get the game ball after the game, I'm giving you the ball because you have been that good for us. Listen, it's like we're playing 4-on-5 with you out here because you're doing nothing. And I was just in his ear talking and just, sharing Jesus with him the whole time. And as he's running up and down the court, I begin to see him do this. Guys, come on. Give me the ball. Guys, come on, pass the ball. Give me the ball. I want the ball. Guys, I'm wide open, standing over here. Come on. And so then I hear him start doing it, and I'm like, that's right, man. You are wide open. I'm terrible at defense. They should get you the ball. You would score a ton of points. They just need you to throw the ball. And so he's just fuming inside. And now all of a sudden they're going over to the huddle, and they were beating us, but now all of a sudden, as they're coming back out onto the court, they throw him the ball, and when they do, he refuses to pass. He drives in, another guy steps in, gets a charge, and all that we get the ball, we go down, score. He gets the ball again, he turns it over. And here's the thing. In life, a lot of times, the greatest attacks that you are going to face, and what the enemy desires to do more than anything, is to get in your head. He wants to get in your head and throw you off of your game. Because listen, if he was standing over here and nobody said anything, and he's happy just standing right over there, having a defender come out and having somebody pulled away from the basket because he's standing in the corner over there. He was happy doing that until somebody started talking. Until somebody started pointing out what he didn't want anybody to see. And then all of a sudden it started to bother him. Why are they taking all the shots? Why are they getting everything? Well, why can't I shoot? I was open. You're not a good I could beat you. And all of a sudden these thoughts begin to go through his head. Listen, what the enemy desires to do in your life is to get in your head to distract you from the calling that God has placed on your life. And so all of a sudden the enemy begins to plant seeds inside of you. And these seeds begin to fester, and these seeds begin to grow. And as these seeds begin to grow, eventually it begins to take over. Because listen, the first time I ran down the court, and the first time I'm talking in his ear, and the first time I'm telling him, man, you are really good. I cannot believe they're not getting the ball to you. He just kind of laughs and plays it off. And then we run back down to the other end of the court, then we come, man, I can't believe you're standing this wide open and they're not throwing you the ball. We run back down, and then we come back down. Man, you should really be shooting. I saw you in warm-ups. You're really good. And then all of a sudden his countenance begins to change. All of a sudden his attitude begins to change. Why? Because there at first was a little seed that was planted into his mind. But then that seed began to grow. Because he was hearing what the enemy wanted to say to him. My goal was not to get him to score. I didn't want him to be successful. I wanted to do anything I could in order to get our team to win. Listen, you have to understand, there is an enemy against God. And as you play on the team of God, he is going to do everything he can in order to distract you, in order to play mind games with you, to get you off the purpose that God has created you for. And a lot of times, it's a little seed that is planted deep down inside of you. And so Jesus begins to address this with the disciples. Because you remember last week, what did he tell the disciples? If you're going to follow me, you have to pick up your cross. If you're going to follow me, trials, tribulations, struggles are inevitable. They will happen. But you have to choose to follow me in the good and the bad. And so when the announcement is good, I'm following you. But then all of a sudden when the announcement is tough, I'm still following you. And now Jesus is looking at his disciples and he's saying, guys, in Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 10, he looks at them and he says, hey guys, if somebody ever offends you, if somebody ever does something to hurt you, they do something that really just bothers you, he said, here's what I want you to do. First, I want you to go to them and I want you to have a conversation. I want you to say, hey, this is how I feel. This is what you did to me. Can we have a conversation and try and make this right? Because listen, a lot of times in these conversations, one-sided conversations and one side of the story is not the complete story. Because what we see and what we feel is oftentimes through limited view sights of our own pride. And so we see a situation and we hear a story and we view that story through our eyes, through our ears, through our mind, which is clouded with pride. And so then it's when we sit down with somebody that we finally begin to understand the full picture of the story. Well, this is why it was said. This is why it happened. And so now I understand. Can we work this out? And can we come to an agreement? And can we get back to the friendship? Can we get back to the relationship that we had before? And so Jesus says, if somebody's done something to you, here's what you need to do. You need to first go to them by yourself. And you need to sit down and have a conversation. And be honest in the conversation. And here's the goal in the conversation. The goal in the conversation, as Jesus is communicating this, is not to point out fault, but it's to bring restoration. And so it's not to point a finger and say, look at you and look at what you've done. The goal of the conversation is to say, listen, my spirit, my heart is hurt, and I want to fix this. How can we best do this? And Jesus says, if they respond right, and if they respond in a way that says, hey, yes, thank you, I'm so sorry, I never meant to do that, then move on and continue that relationship like nothing ever happened. But if they don't, then you need to take somebody with you. Grab a good friend. And this is not, hey, let's go with both barrels loaded. This is not, hey, I need to talk to a friend and then let's go and let's just make sure that we're unloading on them. You were a jerk. Yeah, you were. Hey, you were so mean to me. Yeah, you were. No, it's somebody sitting there that's objective, that is able to look at both sides objectively and have a conversation in order to bring restoration with people. But then Jesus says, if that does not take place, if it still does not happen, then what needs to happen and what needs to take place then is you bring them before the church. And so then what we're going to do is we're going to stand you up in front of everybody and we're going to point at you and say, you were wrong. No, I'm joking. That's not what we want to do. And that's not what Jesus is calling us to do. He's not saying, go stand it in front of everybody and embarrass everybody. He's saying, bring a spiritual advisor into the conversation. Somebody that can then bring people to Scripture and say, this is what God desires for you and for your relationship. This is what God hopes comes out of this. And you two need to figure this out because this is not what God wants. This is a seed that the enemy has placed inside of you that is growing and growing and growing and causing you to be distracted from the plan that God has for your life. And so what you need to do is you need to handle this seed. And you need to do it biblically. And you bring the church in. And the church brings wise men around that can speak into those moments and into those situations. And you hope in those moments that restoration takes place. Because that is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is not to point at people and say, you are wrong, you are wrong. See, when a couple comes in and they are hurting, and they are broken, and they are torn up about their relationship, and when they are sitting in the office and maybe one of them was unfaithful, the goal in that moment is not to point out the sin of one. It's to bring restoration so that they can have the marriage that God created them to have. And here's the thing, forgiveness does not accept wrong. Forgiveness is not looking at the situation and saying, I'm okay with what you did. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is getting past what was done and saying, this is not going to have a hold, and this is not going to keep me from moving forward in my relationship with the Lord. And so you have to understand, as we look at this, an offense is easy to find in somebody, but it's hard to let go. It's easy to find fault in people. It's easy to point the finger. It's easy for people to hurt me. It's easy for people to say things. It's hard to let it go. See, an offense, it's easy to find fault with others than it is to look through their mistake and forgive them. It's easier to find fault and to point at them and say, look at what you did wrong, than to look and say, how can we get past this? And how can we move forward? And so today what I want us to do is I want us to look at 8 things that unforgiveness brings. And then I want us to look at 5 things that reflect forgiveness. And so as Jesus was talking to his disciples in Matthew chapter 18, you get on down to verse 15. And as you get on down to verse 15, it switches tones. And Peter then steps up and looks at Jesus. And Peter being Peter, he just looks at Jesus and he goes, okay, Jesus, hey, I got a question for you. How many times do I have to forgive somebody? Because here's the thing, it's easy, it's not easy, but it's easier for me to forgive somebody that has offended and hurt me than it is to forgive somebody that has hurt my wife or my kids. And so Peter, not thinking about what is easy to forgive, you stick your fork over on my plate and you take, some of my food, I'm going to be mad, but I'll forgive you. But you do something to my kids, it's going to be a little harder to forgive. And so Peter, thinking in this mindset, Peter asked a question. Jesus, how many times do I need to forgive? Like 7? Think about it. 7 times. My wife is a kind, loving, gentle person. But she has threatened to punch people in their face for messing with her kids. We will get in a car and we'll shut the door. And she's like, I cannot believe they said that. I'm going to punch them in the face. I'm like, you go get them. I'd love to see it. But that is a lot harder to forgive than something that's simple. And this is Peter's mindset. Because he's thinking back to times where he's been hurt. And he begins to say, I'm not the most educated person. I struggle with, I was a fisherman that stepped into this role, and now people make comments all the time, Jesus, that I shouldn't be in this role, that I'm not smart enough to be in this role, that I'm not talented enough to be in this role, that I can't do this good enough. How many times do I have to continue to forgive them? Because all they do is belittle me, all they do is make fun of me. I'm tired of it. 7 times? Because that's a big number. Think about it. 7 times. What if somebody came up and found your weakness and continued to exploit it over and over and over and over? You forgive them the first time, okay. Second time, hey, don't do it again, but okay. Third time, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. No, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me. I don't know what it is. It's something like that, and it's really good, and it would have fit perfect. What is it? What's the third one? Oh, that's why I was confused. Then it didn't fit there. Because I was on to the third one. Okay, 3 times. Then you're just crazy for forgiving them. And that's what the way Peter is thinking in his mind. Like, I understand forgiving them a couple times. But over and over and over? 7 times, Jesus? And Jesus looks at Peter and says, Peter, no. And in Peter's mind, he's kind of swelling up because it was a spiritual answer. It wasn't a realistic answer, it was a spiritual answer. Because a realistic answer is 2 or 3 times. How many times should we forgive somebody? 2 or 3 times. How many times are you going to let them hurt you? Let them hurt your family? How many times are you going to, really let them in and continue to forgive? And then all of a sudden, Jesus says, no, Peter. And you can see Peter kind of swelling up in his seat. I know. I gave a spiritual answer. I wanted everybody to know how spiritual I was. And he goes, 70 times 7. And in my mind, real quick math, that's a lot. And he just said, he says 70 times. And everybody's like, 70 times 7. What Jesus is trying to say is that forgiveness is always the right option. No matter what. No matter what. What Jesus desires in us is to forgive. And so 8 signs of a person who is struggling to forgive. The first one is this: you experience bursts of anger at the wrong people. You get mad at the wrong people. Have you ever had a fight with your spouse if you're married? Have you ever fought with your spouse? And then your kid walks through the room and they had nothing to do with it. They didn't say anything. They were just walking through the room and you were yelling at your wife because you were right and you're trying to get across to her that she is wrong. And as your kid walks through the room, all of a sudden why are you walking so loud? Stop walking loud. Go to your room. You're grounded. What did I do? Oh, you know what you did. Stop walking through this house like that. You don't walk like a mouse. You are in trouble. And they're like, I didn't do anything, Dad. Yes, you did. And all of a sudden, your anger begins to come out at the wrong time and towards the wrong people. Because there's a seed that's been planted inside of you of unforgiveness that is beginning to take root and grow into bitterness that is beginning to take over and lash out at people you don't mean to lash out at. Think about it. When a husband or wife comes home from work and they've had a bad day because somebody did something to them, and that seed has been planted and taken root at work all day long, and when they get home, what are they? They're on edge, and they're yelling, and they're angry, and they're mad, because that seed of bitterness, that seed of unforgiveness has begun to sprout inside of them, and it's begun to come out. And so here's the next thing. You can't stand to see people happy. If a seed of unforgiveness and a seed of bitterness has begun to take place in your life, it's hard for you to watch laughter. Think about it. Have you ever been in a room where a person who has bitterness and unforgiveness comes into the room and y'all are all laughing, telling jokes, yeah, this is so funny. I had a friend, I'll tell you a story and y'all will laugh. Because I had a friend who dated a girl in high school. And luckily she was pretty, because when they went on this date, they were walking into the mall and they were talking. And they're just, oh yes, this is so much fun. He goes and he opens the door for her. And instead of going through the open door, she continues walking, bam, right into the glass door. That's funny. But it doesn't end there. They are walking around the mall on the exact same date. And as they're walking through the mall, you know those giant pillars in the middle of the mall? They're walking, she's looking, and as they're talking, bam, runs smack into it. Listen, that's funny. But here's what, you've done it before, huh? But here's what happens. When we begin to laugh and when there is joy and excitement and happiness in the room, bitterness refuses to even put a smile on their face. I don't find the humor in that. It's not funny to me. It's dumb. Why would you make fun of people like that? Why would you laugh at people when they're hurting? And all of a sudden, this bitterness and this unforgiveness begins to have an effect on a room of people around you. And so then you're like, and And you're kind of looking at them like, can I laugh or can I not? Like, this is getting really uncomfortable. Why? Because this bitterness takes root, and as it takes root, it begins to affect all of you. And it begins to come out in you in ways that you never wanted. And so bitterness also makes you negative. Bitterness makes you negative in a way to where when you look at life and when you see things, instead of seeing life through a positive light, you begin to see life in a negative light. Instead of seeing the glass half full in all situations, you see it half empty. And a person that used to be joyful and upbeat, and you see it in people's lives, I can think of it with family members who would walk through the door and dang it. Did this in the first service. I forgot how to skip. I haven't done it in so long. And so you kind of jump and you're like, what is going on? And so you walk into a room and you're happy. There we go. It's a pretty good skip. So, okay, and then you got the moonwalk. No, I can't do that. You walk into a room and you're happy and you're excited and you're joyful, but then that person, in everything that happens, they see it negative. They walk into the room and everything that they see, everything that they view, all of a sudden somebody that used to come into the room with such joy and excitement, they have been hurt in a way, and because of that hurt and the unforgiveness that has been given in that situation, because of that, now all of a sudden they walk into the room and it's just a negative environment, negative atmosphere. Think about it. I'm sure you know somebody that you can see like that. And if you don't know anybody that you can see like that, it might be you. Smile. Next thing is this. A person who is unforgiving finds himself sick a lot. Physically. All of a sudden, this unforgiveness begins to take root, and it begins to affect your health. There was a story that I was told. I don't think they're in here. I don't see them. Wednesday night in our small group. And as we were in our small group, we were talking about this. And we were talking about the things that unforgiveness does. And he said he was on a mission trip. And while he was on a mission trip, as they were going through, they found a man. And this man was hunched over. And they thought it was scoliosis and his spine and everything. And he just could not straighten up. And so he walked around like this. And he went to the doctor, and the doctor would continue to examine him and would continue to run all the tests. And he would look at him and he would say, you are completely and totally fine. There's nothing wrong with you. You are 100% healthy. But yet he literally could not straighten his back. And there was a revival that was taking place, and that's why they were there, and they were sharing the gospel. And as they began to talk about Jesus, and as they begin to talk about what Jesus did on the cross, and as they begin to talk about forgiveness, this man became overcome with emotion. And he was crying uncontrollably because he knew he needed Jesus and he needed the forgiveness of Jesus. And he came down front, and as he comes down front, they're praying with him. And as he's praying with him, he begins to share a story. He said, 30 years ago, I got mad at my dad, and I haven't spoken to him since. And I've been carrying hate and anger and bitterness all these years. And as he's speaking, and as he realizes the forgiveness of God in his life, he begins to straighten up. And he stands up straight with tears running down his face. And he says, I wish more than anything I could tell my dad I'm sorry. But he passed away 2 years ago. See, some of you, your bitterness is so deep that it's beginning to affect your health. You didn't know what it was. But now all of a sudden you're beginning to see this root that has taken hold of your life. And now you find yourself depressed and in bed. Now you find yourself constantly sick, not able to eat, losing weight because of bitterness. The next one is this: you become a secret spy agent to catch the people doing wrong. You know what I'm talking about. You stalk them on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. You watch them and you see them when they walk into a room, and all of a sudden you're sitting there and you see them coming around and you're just like... And instead of watching your child play a game, you got your eyes fixed over here on them the whole time, waiting for them to do something wrong. And you see them, they jump up and they start cheering for their child. Yes, way to go. Good job. You're doing so good. And you're sitting there, I cannot believe the arrogance of them. I cannot believe how arrogant they are to rub it in our face that their child made a shot. Are you kidding me? And all of a sudden you start to nitpick at everything they do in their life so that you can expose their faults to people around you. Because your goal is to bring them down to the level that you're at. Because your misery is desperate for company. And so you're going to do whatever you can in order to bring people down to your level. In order to make them as miserable as you are. And so you start watching everything that they're doing. Did you see them? Look at what she's wearing. Are you kidding me? This is church. Why would she come in that? And you start judging every single thing that they're doing. And you start pointing it out to the people around. You live in the past. And so when you have this root of unforgiveness and bitterness, what do? You're constantly looking to the past because your future is so gray and so dark because of what has happened in the past. Well, I would be different, but my childhood. My mom and dad spanked me. Listen, I would probably be a lot better person if my mom and dad hadn't spanked me. But I grew up in a home that one day, when I got in trouble, my dad would make us go outside and cut a switch off the tree in order to spank us with that switch. And he did it all the time. And so now, and so now he's like, go outside, cut a switch and get in here. And I go out there, and there's a weeping willow right there. You know weeping willows, they're green, man, it's like Indiana Jones's whip. And you can just go out, you know. And then there was a tree next to it that had been dead for 45 years. And there was zero life in it. I went over to the dead tree and I grabbed a branch off of that. And I very gingerly walked that stick into the house. Handed it to my dad, and when he got it, it literally crumbled in his hand. He was so mad. He went outside and he did not get a switch. He brought in the weeping willow tree. But here's the thing. A lot of times what we do is we look to the past and we blame the past for our future. And we blame the past for what's not happening today. Because there's this seed. Listen, I'm not saying my parents did everything right. Luckily, they made a lot of mistakes on me so that I don't have to make those on my kids. And so, I'm joking. Y'all were like, this is uncomfortable. I'm joking. But listen, they weren't perfect. And I can look back into my childhood and I can say, these things happened and this happened, and so because of this, I'm not doing this. I'm not moving forward. And I can live in bitterness and unforgiveness. And that's where we find a lot of us. And listen, forgiveness does not minimize what took place. Okay, you have to understand that. Just because you forgive does not mean that you are minimizing what took place in the past, minimizing the experiences that you have gone through. That's not what I'm saying at all. Some of you have gone through some horrific, hard, terrible things, but here's the thing. Don't let what you have gone through keep you from having the life that God desires for you in the future. God has something greater for you. And just because those things happened does not mean you need to live in the past and not be who God has created you to be. And so the next thing is this. You physically change as a person when you have the root of bitterness. I remember walking through Walmart one day. And as I'm walking through, I saw this lady walking towards me. And I could tell from her eyes, from her mouth, from her forehead, And I could tell by the way that she was just carrying herself that she had the root of bitterness in her life. Just by the way, I didn't know her. I had never met her before in my life. I had never had a conversation with her. But there was something inside of her that was so deep that it literally showed itself physically in her life. Some of you are carrying a root of bitterness that is going to begin to start showing itself physically in your life. The last one is this. When you have the root of bitterness, your desire is to bring others down with you. I hit on this earlier. The desire of people who are miserable is to bring people down to their misery. Nobody likes to be lonely. Even if you're in a low spot, you still want people down low with you. And so here's the thing, 5 things that forgiveness does. 5 things. And so if we have this root of bitterness, what needs to take place? 5 things. First one is this. You have to choose to be forgiving before anything ever happens. Because in the moment, you will never choose forgiveness when the emotions are really high and running deep. When I was a student pastor, I would talk to students often about their relationship physically with other students. And I would caution them, be very, very careful. And I would tell them, you have to make a decision before you're ever in the back seat of the car by yourself that you are going to stay physically pure. Because when you get in the car and you are by yourself, and that girl is looking beautiful, all of a sudden, if you have not made a decision, your emotions and your hormones are going to kick in, and you are not going to make the right decision unless the decision has been made before. It's the exact same thing with forgiveness. Forgiveness is a lot harder to give in the moment. You have to make the decision before you're ever in the moment to forgive no matter what. Well, what if they do something to your wife? I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying that it's not going to be difficult. But what I am saying is we have to make the right decisions and the right choices beforehand so that in the moment I don't let my emotions make my decisions for me. Because if I wait until I'm in the moment, then truth is not going to make that decision. Emotions are going to make that decision. And my emotions will not point me in the right direction. And so I have to then respond right. And so I'm making it before. I'm forgiving. The next thing is this. Forgiveness removes the burden of the offender on your life. Because what you do when you forgive, you take the burden off that's been weighing you down, that's been carrying you. Because here's the thing. When you have a seed of unforgiveness, it begins to weigh in your life and it begins to affect everything in your life. And so now when you walk into a room, no matter what room it is, you're carrying the burden of unforgiveness into that relationship, into that conversation, into that room. And when you walk in, you are carrying that burden with you. And now the offender, who it might have been years ago that this took place, they are still walking with you on a daily basis, offending you over and over and over. And they continue to offend you when you carry that burden on your back. Because then all of a sudden you don't get to trust people the way that you should trust people because you lost trust in the past and you never forgave. And so now your trust in the future, you can't trust. And we have marriage counseling with couples where they will sit down and they will talk about things that happened in the past. And the husband is sitting there and he's saying, but that's not me. But the problem is that she's living in the past and she's carrying that burden of unforgiveness into a relationship where it was never meant to be. And that forgiveness does not minimize the situation in that moment. It does not minimize what took place in that moment in the past. But it frees them as a couple to be who God has created them to be. And so forgiveness removes the burden that you've been carrying around. Forgiveness takes it out of your hands and puts it into God's hands. It's one of the hardest things to do. Okay, God. It's your situation. Okay, God, it's in your hands. It's not in mine. God, I've been carrying this and it's hard. And I hate to see, I hate to see my girls cry. But God, I'm trusting you. Shape them, mold them into who you've created them to be. I hate to see my boys hurt. I hate to see Heather hurt. But God, I trust you. And I'm putting it in your hands. Because it is far better in your hands than it is in mine. Forgiveness shows God's love to other people. See, when I forgive, people are shocked because it's not the natural tendency that we do on a normal basis. Forgiveness is not the normal response of people. To get even is the normal response. To get back. If they say something, what do we want to do? We want to hit them a little lower. You want to do something? Okay, I'm going to hit you a little lower. You want to say something? Okay, I'm coming back with something that's going to hurt just a little more. That's our natural response. And so when we forgive, and when everybody else is responding differently, they don't see us forgiving. They see a God who can forgive. Because if we can forgive in those moments, then they understand that forgiveness can happen to them. And so they see the love of God through our forgiveness of other people. And that's ultimately what we want to do. Our goal is to point people to Jesus. And if me being able to forgive is one way that we can do that, then that's what we want to do. The last thing is this, and we'll close with this. Forgiveness is recognizing that I'm forgiven. Why do I forgive? Because I've been forgiven. See, Jesus looks at Peter in that story, and when he looks at Peter, he begins to tell him a story. He says, Peter, forgive 70 times 7.